Hello everyone, welcome to Stay at Home Shakespeare with A Bit Lit. I'm Emma Whipday, and today I'm going to be talking about one of the most famous ghost stories in the English language, the story of Hamlet being haunted by the ghost of his father. Before I begin, for anyone who's new to the series, Stay at Home Shakespeare is an exploration of ideas in Shakespeare to do with the home. It allows me to explore why the home was significant to Shakespeare and in Shakespeare's England, and what happened when Shakespeare represented the spaces of the home, the family relationships in the home, and ideas about the home on the early modern stage. The series is also called Stay at Home Shakespeare because it involves me speaking to you from my home, possibly to you in your home if you're also in lockdown. And the reason Hamlet is a particularly appropriate play to explore as part of this series is that it's a play that's obsessed with family relationships, and one particular family relationship that we'll be exploring today, the relationship between the father and the son. The play asks, what are the roles that father and son involve? What are the responsibilities that go with those roles? And how can the relationship be continued in what I'm going to call a virtual family relationship? A lot of us will be thinking about virtual relationships at the moment, especially if, like me, you're having a lot of your family relationships through a computer screen or down a phone. This means something slightly different in Hamlet. It means that Hamlet's engaging with his father not in a bodily, corporeal way, but through image and illusion and voice, a virtual, unreal relationship, when his father haunts him from beyond the grave. But in order to think about that, I want to start by reminding you about what an early modern theatre looked like and how we can think about it. Those of you who watched last week's video on Romeo and Juliet will remember my amazing pop-up globe theatre that gives you an idea of the general structures. You'll see there's the stage thrust out into the yard where groundlings stand watching the action, that there are galleries where other audience members sit, that there are pillars holding up the canopy above the stage, and then at the back of the stage there's a stage door and a balcony. Last week, I was mostly talking about how the stage door and the balcony cause the back of the stage, the francinae, to resemble a house, which is particularly helpful if you want to represent a young marriageable woman standing in the window of her home, partly inside the house and under her father's authority, and partly outside the house, open to the male gaze, and able to imagine a world where she can be free of the family bonds to elope with the man that she loves. Today I want to think about a slightly different element of theatrical architecture, and that's the canopy over the stage and the space below the stage. The canopy over the stage partly had a practical role of keeping the rain off for those actors who were performing outdoors, but it also had a key role in ensuring that the audience could imagine the world of the stage. And this world depended on the stage itself being associated with the earth. So the famous Shakespearean lines from As You Like It, all the world's a stage and all the men and women merely players, speak to that idea that when you're walking on the stage, you're walking on the earth. The heavens are the world above the stage, and that's the canopy. And so the canopy above the stage will be decorated to look like the sky, the heavens, with the sun, the moon, the planets, and perhaps the gods. And any characters who were associated with the heavens, so fairies, gods, spirits, would be likely to descend from those heavens from the trapdoor in any kind of flying scene. In contrast, characters that were associated with the world below, with hell, with the demonic, with the devil, with death, with the underworld, would be able to enter and exit through a trapdoor in the stage to the world beneath the stage. Those of you who watched the first video in this series about Macbeth will remember my discussion about the witches and how they were associated with the demonic through their entrance to thunder and lightning. But another way they might have been associated with the demonic would have been if they came up through the trapdoor and disappeared back through it. We know this is a possibility because Banquo comments of the witches, "The earth hath bubbles as the water hath, and these are they." So the idea there being that when water bubbles up, the bubble then pops and vanishes, and similarly the witches seemed to bubble out of the earth and then disappear, so the trapdoor would make that kind of entrance and exit possible. I'm not going to say more right now about why this knowledge is relevant for Hamlet, but I have already hinted that this is a ghost story, and therefore the world beneath the stage, the world of the dead, the world of the demonic, the world of graves, might become relevant. But I want to start now by talking about the opening of the play. And the opening of the play is a masterclass in creating tension and suspense in very few words. It opens on the castle's battlements, and we get two guards entering, Francisco, who's already at his post, and Bernardo, who enters to him. And Bernardo says, "Who's there?" Francisco answers, "Nay, answer me, stand and unfold yourself." Bernardo says, "Long live the king." And Francisco says, "Bernardo?" And Bernardo answers, "He." Now, what's interesting about this is how quickly and economically Shakespeare sets up some key facts in this scene. Bernardo asking who's there and Francisco answering, "Nay, answer me," tells us one fact straight away, that it is dark. So even on an early modern open-air amphitheatre playhouse where the sunlight would have been streaming in to illuminate the stage, or even on a cloudy day, you'd be relying on daylight. These words very speedily set up that in the world of the play, it's nighttime and it's so dark that these characters who know one another, who eventually recognise one another, can't easily see each other. When Francisco then says, "Stand and unfold yourself," he's asking Bernardo to uncloak himself so that he's more visible. And this suggests that Bernardo's cloaked, that he's either hiding or that he's very cold. The characters continue with Francisco saying, "You come most carefully upon your hour." Bernardo says, "'Tis now struck 12. Get thee to bed, Francisco." And Francisco says, "For this relief much thanks. 'Tis bitter cold, and I am sick at heart." So again, we're being reminded of the cold, and we're also being reminded of the time of night. It's just struck 12. It's midnight. It's a sort of witching hour, and it's cold and dark. And Francisco says, "I am sick at heart." That tells us there's something terribly wrong in this castle, something that's affecting Francisco, but we don't yet know what. Bernardo continues, "Have you had quiet, guard?" And Francisco says, "Not a mouse stirring." So we're getting a sense of the stillness and the silence of this freezing cold night. Bernardo then says, "Well, good night. If you do meet Horatio and Marcellus, the rivals of my watch, bid them make haste." So essentially, tell the other guards to hurry up. And this tells us quite clearly what Francisco saying, "I'm sick at heart," has already hinted, that these soldiers are deadly afraid. Francisco continues, "I think I hear them. Stand ho, who's there?" So again, jumpy and frightened and unsure who's coming towards them in the dark. Later in their conversation, we discover the reason for their fear. Marcellus says, "What, has this thing appeared again tonight?" Bernardo says, "I have seen nothing." And Marcellus says, "Horatio says 'tis but our fantasy." So we know that there's something here that Horatio doesn't believe, which is clever because it tells us, the audience, that we can side with Horatio if we want to, in also being sceptical of the stories we're about to hear. And Horatio agrees, saying, "Tush, tush, 'twill not appear." And Bernardo continues, "Sit down a while, and let us once again assail your ears, that are so fortified against our story, what we have 2 nights seen." So essentially saying, your ears don't believe me, but I'm going to assail them, I'm going to attack them with my ghost story again, to try and convince you. So again, the audience is in the same position as Horatio there, unbelieving, not so sure if they believe in this ghost, but willing to hear the story. And Horatio says, "Well, sit we down, and let us hear Bernardo speak of this." So it's the middle of the night, it's freezing, they're terrified, and so they decide to sit down and tell a ghost story about a ghost that's appeared to them at this time, in this place. And so Bernardo says, "Last night of all, when yon same star that's westward from the pole had made his course to illume that part of heaven where now it burns, Marcellus and myself, the bell then beating one." So essentially what he's saying is, last night when the sky looked exactly the same as it does now, because it was the same time as now, and the bell was beating one, And he's about to say, "We saw a ghost," but he's prevented because at that moment the ghost itself enters. This is an utterly chilling moment. It's comparable to those moments in old horror movies where someone says a certain demon's name a certain number of times or talks to them in the mirror, and then suddenly that invokes them and they appear. They've talked about the ghost in the middle of the night and now the ghost has entered, but it doesn't speak. And Marcellus says, "Peace, break thee off, look where it comes again." And Bernardo says, "In the same figure, like the king that's dead." So the scene is playing on an anxiety here about whether or not we believe this is the ghost of the dead king. He says it's like the king that's dead. This is something that Hamlet wonders about later when he finds out about the ghost, whether it's an angel or a demon pretending to be the ghost of his father, or whether in fact it's his father's spirit. The ghost refuses to speak to them and eventually exits, and they realise that the ghost probably wants to talk to Hamlet, the son of the dead king. And they convince Hamlet to speak to it, and then Hamlet agrees to go off with the ghost who's beckoning to him in order to talk to him in private against everyone's advice. And Hamlet feels that he owes this ghost something because he seems to be the ghost of his father, that perhaps he owes him the duties of a son to his father. So he says to the ghost, "Speak, I am bound to hear." The ghost seems to agree that Hamlet has these duties, because he continues, "So art thou to revenge what thou shalt hear." So I talked a bit earlier about how this play is interested in what the roles and responsibilities of father and son are. Here Hamlet suggests that a son's role is to listen to his father, even when his father visits him in the form of a ghost. The ghost seems to suggest that a son's role is not just to listen, but to act. "So art thou to revenge when thou shalt hear." Hamlet says, "What?" And the ghost says, "I am thy father's spirit, doomed for a certain time to walk the night, and for the day confined to fast in fires, till the foul crimes done in my days of nature are burnt and purged away." So essentially, he seems to be saying that he's in purgatory. He's in something like hell because he has to fast in fires when he's not walking the night as a ghost, but he's burning away his sins, which suggests that eventually he'll be able to go to heaven, and that's the role of purgatory. What's interesting is this is a play written for Protestant England, and yet Hamlet is invoking, and therefore Shakespeare is invoking, Catholic purgatory, as many critics of this play have noticed. But the reason I want to talk to you about this scene is because, again, it's associating Hamlet's father, the ghost, with the world below the stage, with the world of hell and purgatory and perpetual fires. Hamlet's father continues, "List, list, O list," meaning listen. "If thou didst ever thy dear father love." And Hamlet says, "O God," and the ghost says, "Revenge his foul and most unnatural murder." So again, there's this play on what a son owes his father. Hamlet's father is saying that if Hamlet ever loved him, then the thing he needs to do is revenge his death. And those of you who are familiar with the play will know that the whole rest of the play relies on the fact that Hamlet struggles to do this. He loves his father and will listen to him, but he struggles with his father's, or the ghost of his father's, suggestion that if he listens, he should also act. He should also revenge. And I want to move for a moment here to thinking about what expectations were around being a father or a son in this period, in the country more broadly. And so this is in Elizabethan times. I talked last week in video number 2 on Romeo and Juliet about the importance of conduct literature in this period, literature that told people how to behave. Another key form that told people how to behave was sermons or homilies, and some of these were state-sanctioned sermons. They were sermons that the monarch wanted to be preached in every church throughout the country. And one of these sermons was called an exhortation concerning good order and obedience to rulers and magistrates. It's quite telling that one of the key ideas that Elizabeth wanted preached in churches around the country in sermons was the idea of obeying a ruler. And in this sermon, there is the line, "Some are in high degree, some in low, some kings and princes, some inferiors and subjects, priests and laymen, masters and servants, fathers and children, husbands and wives, rich and poor, and every one have need of the other. This is an absolutely central idea in Elizabethan England, the idea of the world being built as a hierarchy, where some people are ruling and some people are ruled, and the rulers need the ruled, and the ruled need the rulers. So here, the idea of kings and princes who rule their subjects is coupled with masters who rule their servants, fathers who rule their children, husbands who rule their wives. Ruling the state is coupled with ruling the domestic world, ruling the family, ruling the home. And this is a really popular idea in early modern conduct literature as well. In the widely published conduct book Of Domestical Duties, William Gouge argued, "So we may say of inferiors that cannot be subject in a family, they can hardly be brought to yield such subjection as they ought in church or in commonwealth." So to put it simply, if people aren't willing to obey their rulers in their family, their master or their husband or their father, and you'll notice how much these ideas of ruling and ruled are in gendered terms, which was of course slightly disrupted by having a Queen Elizabeth on the throne. But if people couldn't be ruled in their families, Gouge is arguing, then they couldn't be ruled in the state. If they wouldn't be ruled by their father, say, then they also wouldn't be ruled by their king or their queen. So there was a huge anxiety in this period about household rebellion, because it could also mean rebelling against your country. And why is this relevant to Hamlet? Well, because Hamlet finds himself in a very difficult position where he's supposed to obey his father, but his father is coming to him from beyond the grave and tells him that his uncle murdered him. His uncle is now the king, and therefore his uncle should also be obeyed. And Hamlet has a crisis of authority about which man to obey. But he also, in more simplistic terms, has a crisis because his father is a ghost, and he doesn't know whether to treat him as a father or whether as some sort of demonic thing, something otherworldly, something not to be respected, but rather feared or even laughed at. And we can see this in the scene I'm about to talk about and I'm about to end on, which will finally bring all the threads I've been discussing in this video together, because it lets us think about Hamlet's father's ghost in relation to the space beneath the stage. This is later in the same scene where Hamlet first sees the ghost, and Hamlet makes Horatio and Marcellus, who you'll remember from the start of the play, swear never to reveal what they know of the ghost. He says, "Never make known what you have seen tonight." And Horatio and Marcellus say, "My lord, we will not." And Hamlet says, "Nay, but swear it." And Horatio says, "In faith, my lord, not I." And Marcellus continues, "Nor I, my lord, in faith." Hamlet says, "Upon my sword," asking them to swear still further. And Marcellus says, "We have sworn, my lord, already." And Hamlet says, "Indeed, upon my sword, indeed." And here we have another appearance of the ghost. Except appearance isn't quite the right word, because the ghost doesn't appear on stage at all. He merely speaks from beneath it. So we hear the voice of the ghost from below the stage saying, "Swear." And those of you who watched the video on Macbeth will know that I mentioned that cannonballs were used to be rolled back and forth above the stage to create the sound of thunder and to create the vibration, the rumble of the theatre that would make people really feel the thunder if they were in the audience. And here, the voice of the ghost beneath the stage is having the same effect. The whole stage would have vibrated with the sound of this ghost calling up "swear" from beneath. And Hamlet responds to the ghost by saying, "Aha, boy, sayest thou so? Art thou there, true penny?" which means honest fellow. "Come on, you hear this fellow in the cellarage. Consent to swear." Now what's striking is, in his last conversation with the ghost, Hamlet treated him essentially as his father. He swore to revenge his murder. He was, you could say, polite and respectful. Here he refers to the ghost in very different terms. He calls him boy, he calls him truepenny, he calls him fellow, none of them particularly respectful, all of them suggesting that it's he who's in authority, seemingly because he's the one who's on the stage rather than calling out swear underneath it. He's quite literally in vertical authority over his father here. But there's also a sense that he's responding to the ghost as one does respond to a ghost, perhaps with fear, but also with a sort of uncomfortable laughter. And what's striking about the image he uses here, when he says you hear this fellow in the cellarage, is that it's a moment of what we could call meta-theatre, a moment when the play reminds us that it is a play, because Hamlet is talking about the cellarage. I don't think from where he is in the castle, he'd necessarily be talking about the literal cellars of the castle, which are presumably very far down. He seems to be talking about the cellarage as the wooden space beneath the stage. So the actual actor playing the ghost would be running round beneath the stage saying swear and calling it up. And Hamlet seems to be referencing that when he talks about the ghost as the fellow in the cellarage. The scene continues with Horatio saying, "Propose the oath, my lord," and Hamlet says, "Never to speak of this that you have seen. Swear by my sword," and the ghost again beneath the stage says, "Swear," and Hamlet says, "Hic et ubique," and please excuse my Latin pronunciation there. I'm afraid I've never studied Latin, but I know that this means here and everywhere, so essentially wherever Hamlet runs on the stage, the ghost is still beneath him. And he says, "Then we'll shift our ground. Come hither, gentlemen, and lay your hands again upon my sword, never to speak of this that you have heard. Swear by my sword." And again we hear the ghost beneath the stage say, "Swear." And Hamlet says, "Well said, old mole, canst work in the earth so fast." So here we have a shift from referring to the cellarage. Now Hamlet is calling his father's ghost an old mole, which seems to be referring to the idea that he's burrowing beneath the earth like a mole and moving beneath the stage. But there also seems to be a play here on the idea that his father has appeared to him as a ghost, but his father's body is dead and buried. It's in the earth. So the idea is that almost his body is burrowing through the earth in order for him to be able to call out from these different positions to Hamlet. So he's at once playing on the idea of the beneath of the stage, a cellarage, and the idea of bodies being buried in the earth, in a grave. The ghost again says, "Swear," and Hamlet says, "Rest, rest, perturbed spirit." So here he's referencing that idea I set up at the beginning of this video, the idea that the ghost is moving back and forth under the stage as he moves back and forth in purgatory. This space is associated with the demonic, and therefore he's an unrestful spirit. He's walking on the earth, and he's also unrestful when he's trapped beneath it. So here in this one brief aspect of the scene, Shakespeare's drawing together all these different ways of reading the ghost beneath the stage. And it's significant that he's also setting up the space beneath the stage as important. And it's going to be important again later in the play, as those of you who know it will know, for Ophelia's burial scene, where the trapdoor will be opened up to become a grave, and the comic gravediggers will pull out bones and a skull from it, a skull that's revealed to be the skull of the king's jester, Yorick, who Hamlet knew. So in this later scene, this space beneath the stage associated with graves is going to become very important. And therefore here the play is setting up this web of associations to do with graves, the earth, the cellar beneath the stage, and the afterlife. That's all I'll be discussing for today, but next week I'm going to be revisiting Shakespearean tragedy to talk about locks and keys and domestic violence in Othello. Those of you who've been watching this series will have noticed that I often do a shout out to a particular theatre at the end of the video as a way of hopefully fundraising for them. So if you enjoyed this video, if you have a couple of pounds spare, and if you'd like to, I suggest donating a couple of pounds to a theatre that means something to you. And for this week I'm going to suggest the RSC, the Royal Shakespeare Company, because I'm embarrassed to admit it now, but when I first read Hamlet as an undergraduate, I was deeply underwhelmed. I'd read quite a lot of Shakespeare by that point. I loved Shakespearean drama, but Hamlet, it seemed very long, it seemed quite depressing, I'll be honest. I did not fall in love with it. And then I saw the RSC production, directed by Greg Doran, starring David Tennant as Hamlet with Patrick Stewart as the father's ghost. And that scene really did make my hair stand on end. I was terrified, and that hugely affected how much I now love and am excited by Hamlet. So if you do fancy donating a couple of pounds to them, that would be wonderful. Thank you very much for taking the time to watch, and I'll look forward to seeing you next week when I'm going to talk about Othello.